Welcome back to the Book Reporters. Today we're heading back to ancient Rome. We'll be examining some of its greatest emperors to see what they actually did on a daily basis. And what they wanted the public to know. Or not know. A few months ago, I gave a glowing review to Mary Beard's SPQR. I thought it presented an excellent overview of ancient Roman history, society and culture. It offered interesting arguments and insights that would be worthwhile to read for total newcomers to ancient Rome as well as interested amateurs like me. For that reason, her new book, Emperor of Rome, was one of my most anticipated books for this past year. Unfortunately, it didn't live up to my high expectations. Be sure to like and subscribe. And comment below on who's your favorite Roman emperor. I don't mean to imply this is a bad book by any means. It probably would be very interesting to a total newcomer to the subject. Beard is a talented writer who employs a breezy, almost conversational style and obviously is an expert in the field. Also, one of her strengths as a historian is that she refuses to overinterpret the available evidence. She's not afraid to admit that there are many things that we simply cannot know about the actual day-to-day lives of the emperors. Unfortunately, that reticence to fill the gaps in the evidence led to a book that deals more in generalities and a kind of view from 10,000 feet than a detailed analysis of what emperors actually did. One section of the book, studying the changing styles of portrait busts to make dynastic statements, is essentially recycled material from another book of hers, The 12 Caesars. Her description of how the emperorship developed, with civil wars producing increasingly powerful warlords, from Sulla to Augustus, is likewise very familiar to readers of SPQR. New to me but not particularly interesting was the long section looking at the etiquette for seating and use of water features at imperial dinner parties. Another problem I had with the book is that she only writes about the early empire. By contrast, Olivier Hekster's recent Caesar Rules, The Emperor in the Changing Roman World, covers the period through the 6th century. I think he's better able to articulate what it meant to be a Roman emperor by noting the ways it changed over the centuries. Traditionally, historians have divided the empire into at least two phases, one being the Principate, established by Augustus, in which the emperor cloaked his power in a sort of fiction, whereby he was merely the first among equals with the Senate, and the Dominate, in which emperors broadcast their absolute power with increasingly elaborate court rituals. Accompanied by the so-called barracks emperors, who spent their brief reigns during the crisis of the 3rd century desperately fighting off constant invasions as a transitional period in between. The emperors of the Principate oversaw a tiny bureaucracy, leaving much of the running of the empire to local elites in city councils, whereas the Dominate oversaw an explosion of bureaucratic officials. The central power took on more and more authority while local elites withdrew from civic responsibility. Hekster emphasizes that these were real long-term trends, but disputes the idea that there was any kind of neat dividing line between the eras. He insists that all the supposed characteristic features of the Dominate had precedence in the early empire. By tracing each new development in this way, I think he is able to shine a better light on what it meant to be emperor. Both authors spend a lot of time discussing how emperors presented themselves to their public audiences, but Hekster approaches the subject more systematically and from more angles. For instance, in addition to studying portrait busts as Beard does, Hekster also uses numismatic evidence to examine the changing nature of imperial self-representation. Roman coins contain a wealth of information about how emperors chose to promote themselves. For instance, the early emperors emphasized military, civil, and religious imagery in roughly equal percentages on their coins, while the 5th century emperors hugely emphasized military symbolism, overcompensating for real-world failures. Likewise, I was surprisingly interested in the changing uses of names and titles on coins. Roman imperial names can be confusing, especially given the frequency of adoptions and additions of titles and honorifics. The only constant over time was the use of Augustus. Other titles rose and fell in popularity depending on the dynasty. Caesar, Tribunicia Potestas, and Imperator were common for the first few centuries, with Pius Felix and Dominus Noster becoming routine in the 4th century, reflecting a change of emphasis from civil to more authoritarian elements of the emperor's persona. I'm sad to say I didn't learn much from Beard's book, but I did learn a lot from Hekster's. Beard's description of the imperial cult, from its forebears in Hellenistic societies to its popular appeal, was fine, but I was more interested to learn from Hekster how it continued even after the empire became officially Christian and other pagan shrines were officially banned. As he says, Christian authors like Gregory of Nazianzus tried to formulate a way in which the worship of the imperial portrait could continue within a Christian context, and strikingly, the Vandal invasions of the 5th century, which took much of North Africa out of imperial control, did not put an end to appointing a priest for the imperial cult. Likewise, the relationship between emperor and senators comes into better focus in Hekster's book when he examines two trends of the later empire. First, the exclusion of senators from army commands starting in the late 3rd century, and secondly the rise of Christian bishops as another group of non-military elites that needed to be placated. The Roman senatorial elite were fantastically wealthy, owning estates spread out over many provinces and whose networks of patronage gave them a hard-to-define source of influence. In the early empire, emperors were expected to spend time with senators and hear their concerns. When the emperors stopped residing in Rome in the 3rd century, bishops gradually began to fill similar roles as imperial companions and as a corporate body that needed to be appeased. Emperors convened and presided over church councils in a way not too dissimilar to when they had presided over senatorial debates. He compares emperors routinely starting messages to the Senate with "Me and my army are well," emphasizing the potential for imperial violence, with the presence of imperial troops at church councils like the Second Council of Ephesus in 449. This is all just to say that if what you're looking for is a basic primer on what we know about the early emperors, then Mary Beard's Emperor of Rome is a fine choice, but Olivier Hekster's A Caesar Rules approaches the subject in a more sophisticated way that is both more detailed and far-reaching.